Welcome to the Avro Heritage Museum podcast, supported by Museum Development North and Arts Council England.
Hello, and thank you for listening to this latest episode of our podcast with me, Chris Beswick, and my colleague Frank Pleszak, author and blogger. Our guest today, for the first of a two-part conversation, is Paul Ormerod. Like Steve Rees earlier this year, Paul is relating the story of his father, John Ormerod, another Lancaster flight engineer. And like so many young airmen, he carried a nickname, Curly Ormerod. He joined 101 Squadron at Ludford Magna, and his first bombing operation was on Berlin in November 1943. He was to go back to Berlin 7 more times. His last operation was on Aachen on the 27th of May 1944. 101 Squadron from October 1943 was deploying specialist electronic countermeasures to jam radio frequencies used by the Germans to transmit to their night fighters. This top-secret system was called ABC, or Airborne Cigar. But 101 Squadron was different in another key aspect. Their Lancasters had an 8th crew member, a fluent German speaker, who not only listened in to the German transmissions to decide which ones to jam, but also transmitted messages in German to confuse the night fighters. They represented a greater threat to the aircraft than all the flak that exploded around them as they were lit up by searchlights. And the aircrew carried out all these additional top-secret tasks, as well as meeting the challenges of delivering a payload of bombs to the target. Because the jamming transmissions could be detected, 101 Squadron suffered exceptionally heavy casualties. In today's episode, we hear how a photo flash device is jammed in the bomb bay. It's supposed to drop with the first bomb and has a short timed fuse designed to light up the sky over the target for the cameras in the Lancaster to record the impact of the bombs that they've dropped. And if it stays hung up in the bomb bay and the photographic flash powder is ignited, it will set fire to the aircraft. We also learn how easily aircraft on a sortie could fatally damage each other. And we're told just how much the odds were stacked against bomber crews if they were ever to hope to complete a tour of the magical 30 operations, which then might give them a respite from combat. But we started off by asking Paul how easy it had been to get his father to talk about those war experiences.
Well, he basically talked about it as he got older, because as it happens, I don't quite know how it came about. But their full crew, all 8 of them, were still alive really until the early 2000s. They gradually died away. But at some point, the 101 Squadron Association was either formed or contacted them. And so then they went every year to Ludford Magna, which was the base from which they flew. There was a dinner for them in Lincoln on the Saturday night. And then there was like a church service, and then an RAF band, laid a memorial leaf, and a Lancaster flew over. So they got back together then, but by then, they were all well into the 70s. And so, they did talk about it a lot more. Although when they were together, it was all as if it had been, jolly good fun. But in fact, but he didn't talk about it much, no.
Start to tell us his story a little bit about what he did in the RAF, what his role was as a Lancaster crew member and so on. And then I know there's a whole story to be told about the particular squadron that he was in, isn't there?
Yes, well, he was the engineer on the Lancaster, which meant he had to understand every little bit of how the Lancaster actually operated. He also had to learn, obviously, to stand in for the pilot because he sat next to him, just in case. So he did know, how to land, which was the main thing. But his job was to keep the aircraft serviceable, to make sure there's enough fuel. They were often, hit by flak or once or twice by German fighters. Quite a number of times had at least one engine out of service, so he had to, if you like, tune the entire machine so that it continued to fly and they could get back home safely, even just on 3, or I think on one occasion, just on 2 engines.
And tell us a bit about the particular squadron that he was in.
Well, the squadron he was on was 101 Squadron, which was in Ludford Magna in Lincolnshire. And this was a special squadron because they had an 8th member of the crew, who was, in fact, apparently kept quite separate from them. So on the base, all the 8th crew members had to sleep together in the same huts. Because their role was top secret. Their role, they were fluent German speakers, and they had advanced radio equipment with which they tried to interfere with the operations of the German night fighter force, which was, of course, the major threat to the bombers. They lost some through collisions, some through anti-aircraft fire, but it was the night fighters who inflicted most of the losses. And so the 8th crew member would obviously speak German as they were, over Germany, over the target. And I think a downside was that obviously any equipment like that emitted radio waves, which in turn enabled the Germans to identify aircraft using it more easily. Though I'm not certain about this, I think that the 101 Squadron result may well have had the highest proportionate losses of all Lancaster squadrons.
It is true that as well. And this, I mean, for me, it's fascinating because everybody thinks of a Lancaster having 7 crew members. So here they had, as a standard, an 8th crew member. It is really intriguing because it's actually a little known piece of Lancaster history, that. And these Lancasters were specially modified, and they're very, very distinctive because they've got 2 huge, great big aerials on the top of the fuselage. And as you say, this 8th member, sometimes known as a special operator or an SO, would be curtained off from the others. And it was early electronic countermeasures. It was the beginning of that. And they dropped things like window, which was the aluminium foil, and jammed the German night fighters' radio frequencies. It's amazing, really. And as you say, they actually went out with every bombing mission. So they were there every time. And because they were so distinctive in what they did, they were targeted. And as you said, they became quite significantly hit, really. I had a look, and it's very difficult to find what actual equipment they did. And as you said, some of them were German speakers, and they would actually broadcast on German radio frequencies incorrect information as well. But
I think the one on my dad's cruise, they were fluent German speakers, and they would try and get onto the night fighters' frequency and say things like whatever it was, return to base or something, to try to give them confusing instructions. So it wasn't just a question of jamming the frequencies. It was actually trying to give false instructions to the attacking force.
Yeah, they used things like tinsel, which was another code name, and basically what they used to do is they used to wire their broadcasting equipment up to the engines, and they used to broadcast this down the German radio frequencies as well. That was known as tinsel, and I think they used to do that in 101 Squadron as well as window, which was the aluminium strip. So it was, the earliest use of this electronic countermeasures, which, is so significant now, isn't it? It's incredible, really. And the fact that it had this 8th crew member is just fascinating.
Well, it's because I do think, like I said, during operations, they weren't allowed to socialise even because it was top secret. Like you say, it was one of the first, maybe the first ever serious electronic countermeasure.
I think it was,
And so it was top secret. I mean, obviously the crew knew what he was, knew they were speaking in German on the plane, but they weren't allowed to, you weren't allowed to ask what he actually did.
And it was the voice transmissions that made them particularly vulnerable then, Frank.
Yeah, well, they were using VHF, which wasn't used in Bomber Command at all. Well, I think the first use of VHF radios in Bomber Command was the Dam Busters, when Guy Gibson used it to talk to the other. He controlled the Dam Busters mission using VHF radios. Fighters had used it, but not bombers. So this.
Well, I think it's a good example of how a measure you might take leads to countermeasures from the opposition. So you mentioned the window, which I think all crews used, which I think came into operation a few months before my dad started it at the end of November 1943. And of course, when they scattered that, it actually tried to confuse German radar by seeming there'd be so many planes that they couldn't. But then the Germans then adapted. My dad thought that, in fact, they might have been better off without it, because apparently the German night fighters then adopted different tactics, that rather than relying on their ground radar to find and locate a bomber and then to hone in on it and get within visual sighting, the Germans then adopted more, if you like, what we might call entrepreneurial tactics, and the fighters, found the bomber force, guided them onto them, found the bomber force themselves, and then followed them over the target, where, of course, there was much more illumination and they were much more vulnerable than they would otherwise have been. In fact, I was going to comment on the cockpit experience here at the museum, which is very, very good and very, very impressive. Although I don't think, well, according to what my dad used to say, especially over Berlin, it's not bright enough. He said it's the brightest light he's ever experienced.
Really? Yeah.
Because there were so many searchlights, there were extensive fires on the ground, but more importantly, above the bomber force, there were high-flying fighters which dropped flares so to illuminate the bombers. So the ones that were actually in the stream, he said it was brighter than any daylight, and said, if he'd had chance, he could easily have read a newspaper without any problem. He said it was, he said it was the brightest light. When they were actually the short time they were actually over the target, he said it was just incredibly light.
Yeah. You've mentioned, Frank, that obviously they took part in many, many operations. Were there any particular operations, Paul, that your dad talked about them?
There were several, actually. One of which was towards the end of his tour, because the Lancasters, the bombers carried a photo flash. And so when they dropped their bombs, they had to fly dead straight for 30 seconds so the photo flash could leave the aircraft and take a picture. So that was partly for information, so that the RAF intelligence could see what was happening on the ground in the German cities. But it was also a measure to ensure that the crews didn't drop their bombs over the North Sea and gain extra height away from the anti-aircraft. So it made sure that and in fact, if they didn't get a photo, the trip wasn't counted towards their tour of 30 operations. But on this one, the Lancaster was essentially just an enormous bomb bay with just a few little seats for the crew. And it was just a bomb bay. And they dropped the bombs and the photo flash was stuck.
There was a camera just near the bomb aimer's position, and that was positioned right at the front of the aeroplane. And as it said, they were obliged to stay over the target, take this picture and bring it back. And if they did bring it back and get a good image, they were actually awarded what was known as like an aiming point card. And it was a postcard showing the squadron, the mission, and all the crew names. And you see these aiming point cards quite regularly.
Yeah, but what happened was he got stuck, so he had to swivel round in his seat. The bomb bays were wide open. He's over the target at 20,000 feet. And the photo flash went off in 30 seconds. So he had to stand over the bomb bay and kick it out. And so he said, even though it was 20 degrees below, he'd never sweated as much in his life. And he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Medal for that. So that was an important one. Another one was they took part in the Nuremberg raid of the 30th of March 1944, which of course was the highest losses, when I think nearly 97 or nearly, around 96 Lancasters were lost. And his crew always had, as they crossed the English coast coming back, they always had a sweepstake as to how many had been lost. And he said 100, because he said he'd seen them just go down all the time. But after each operation, they were debriefed. They had to go to debriefing officers who tried to extract information from them.
Yeah.
And he said when they asked how many he thought had been lost, he said, 100. He was nearly put on a charge because he thought he'd lost his nerve, and he was deliberately exaggerating. And, obviously when the information came through, he was vindicated, but they survived that. I suppose the most dangerous one, I can't just remember exactly which city it was. I've got his logbook so I could check it. When they crashed into another Lancaster, because obviously the bomber stream was very concentrated, and they were trying to get hundreds of planes over the target in a matter of minutes. And he said he was going along, and he just, shouted to his pilot to pull up because he could see they were over a Lancaster, and its propellers scored the undercarriage. But of course, the one that had hit them, went, because its propellers were wrecked, went straight down and they all died. And so they had to land with their undercarriage damaged. It turned out at least, because he then had to shine his lamp. I think it was called an Aldis lamp.
An Aldis lamp, yeah.
They had when they were getting near the target, and you could see that one of the tyres was completely ripped. So they had to take emergency positions on the landing. But even so, he was knocked out. I think he was concussed for well over a day as a result. But then a few days later they were flying again. But I suppose the other one, there was a notorious one, because in the run up to D-Day, the Lancasters were diverted from attacking German cities. German industrial sites, I should say. There was no plan to attack cities, of course. That they were diverted to attack transportation systems in France to try and make it much harder for the Germans to bring the defensive forces at the time of the invasion. And initially, it was deemed, because France was a short tour and they weren't facing massive German anti-aircraft fire, that this would only count a third of a trip towards their 30. But then they attacked somewhere called Neuilly-le-Camp, which was a complete farce, and losses were very heavy, nearly as heavy in percentage terms as on Nuremberg, because the communication system went completely wrong. The main force, they arrived early, so everything that could go wrong went wrong. They were meant to have pathfinders, and something went wrong with them. Leading aircraft which guided them in and dropped signals, dropped flares to guide them in. Something went wrong there. They had a master bomber who was flying much lower. A very experienced flyer might fly at, say, 3,000 feet, perhaps in a Mosquito, over the target, so they could have much better view, and then could broadcast to the main force. But my dad said all they got on his frequency were Canadian wheat prices. So, but they could see, because they had to then orbit, for some reason, the target, the whole, hundreds of bombers. And of course, all the German night fighters had the chance then to zoom in on them. And so my dad, remember, he said to the pilot, let's just get out of here. And so they flew away from the main force, and watched from about, 10, 20 miles distance, and watched them all getting shot down. But after that operation, all the French operations were restored to a full operation. Yeah. And you can see in his log, but one before that, it's, I can't remember where it was, it's, 1/3 of a trip. And that's been altered then by some officers say, full trip. So I suppose those were the outstanding ones, the ones that he mentioned.
When did he actually stop flying in Lancaster?
He stopped on that was interesting itself. His last operation was on the 27th of May, 1944. So it's just before D-Day. Engineers were trained separately from the rest of the crew. Their training was much longer because they had to understand everything about the aircraft, not just a specialist task. And so the crews were initially mixed. So he'd flown one more operation than most of the rest of the crew. I think there was one who'd got a few to go, but the others just had a trip to go when they'd finished. And he said, no. But he'd finished his tour, and he said, no, he was going to fly that. So the next day when they woke up, they were all called out to do some, physical exercises or something. And then Sergeant or somebody came along and said, Ormerod, get your uniform, commanding officer wants to see you. He thought, right, what have I done wrong? So he goes into the commanding officer's office, who said, all your kit's packed, you leave the base now, you've completed your tour. He said, you're the first man for several months who've completed a tour of 30 operations from this base. And he said, I want somebody to finish. It might break our jinx. He said, but you're not to contact, this is a formal order, you're not to contact your crew members under any circumstances. Because obviously they didn't want that message spreading around, that nobody had finished in 6 months.
Thank you to Paul for introducing us to his dad, John, and for sharing those stories with us. Next time, how the difference between life and death can turn on a random act. We also learn about how flight engineers were trained. And we learn how variations in flying conditions could mean that you landed back home with only fumes in the tanks. And just how easy was it to get a drink before you went to Buckingham Palace with your dad to get a medal from the King? Please join us for that episode. That's all for now. It's goodbye from me, Chris Beswick.
Make sure you follow us in your podcast app to ensure that you don't miss out on future episodes.